Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you for joining us for today's session focused on the sustainability of repository networks, where we have been fortunate to be able to bring together a group of panelists to kick off our discussion and also participate in the conversation to highlight some of the areas in which they've been working in sustainable networks. And we have a set of motivating questions that we provided in the information for the session and that we have in the shared notes document that we can use as one way to sort of structure our conversation, but also we would be happy to welcome other questions or discussion points as well. Just for logistical, for a logistical introduction, we do have the shared notes document. Matt, could you possibly paste that link in again for folks that might have joined after you put that into the chat? So if you could please sign in so we can know who joined us. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to stay within this particular session for the entire session.
Sorry, could you say that again?
We're going to be staying in the session. We're not going to be going into any breakouts. Matt's going to be helping out, monitoring the chat, and helping with some of the note taking, but also we would welcome any and all of you to also contribute to the notes, as you might have some additional insights or suggestions that are coming out of the discussion. And we are really wanting this to be a participatory session where we have some brief introductions from our panelists, but then we really want to open up the floor for discussions, comments from everybody, and comments on the questions that we'll be posing. Again, along those lines, we do have our reminder that we are all, through participation in the session, agreeing to abide by the ESIP community guidelines, and the link to the guidelines is provided in the shared notes as well as information about how to report any incidents related to those guidelines. So yeah, our goals for the session today are really to start, or for many of us, continue a conversation about how we can effectively work at sustaining the networks of data repositories that many of us interact with. Many of them originating in sponsored projects of some form or another, or multiple sponsored projects that have been the frequent model for maintaining continuity and growth and evolution of networks. But needless to say, that is a somewhat nerve-wracking approach, and one that does not necessarily ensure the longevity and vibrancy of the networks that we are building and participating in. So what we're hoping to be able to do here is to, through our discussion, be able to start to identify some successful strategies that may have already been identified or may be in the process of being developed, and looking at ways in which we can potentially build on those successes or learn from them. And also looking at opportunities for collaboration between networks as one potential additional sustainability strategy for being able to essentially, perhaps adopt a model of, many hands make light work. If we can spread the effort and develop capabilities that allow us to more effectively interact with each other in terms of the repositories within our networks and the networks themselves being able to interoperate and hopefully operate more efficiently. So these are just a couple of of outcomes that we identified in trying to define the session. But again, as we go through our discussion, we would welcome other insights or suggestions along the lines of how we can sustain these networks of repositories. With that, I would like to now introduce our 4 panelists who we invited to introduce themselves and the networks that they work with as a way to sort of kick off our session. And we have Amber Budden, who is the Director of Learning and Outreach for NCEAS, who's going to provide some background on NCEAS and her work in Data One. We have Kirsten Leonard, President of IGSN, and has been working at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory on a series of activities related to repositories and networks of repositories. Daniela Lowenberg from the University of California, who is working with the Dryad repository and the work of Dryad in connecting to some of the other networks that we'll be talking about. And then Christine Kirkpatrick from the San Diego Supercomputer Center, who has been working with EarthCube and is the director of EarthCube, and the work that they're doing to build and maintain the network that's been developed there. So with those brief introductions, maybe I'd first ask Amber to kick off our introductory comments.
Thanks so much, Carl, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. I see a number of names that I know and some people that I don't. So that means I don't know how familiar everyone is with Data One, but in terms of the prompts and the discussions, I know that one of them was to give an example of sustainability activities. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Data One and how we're moving forward with Data One. So Data One is a network of data repositories, largely in the earth and environmental sciences. We have a network of nearly 50 repositories that participate as members within Data One. We were initially funded in 2009 through the NSF DataNet initiative, which came out of the Office of Cyber Infrastructure. And that was a 5-year funding program, renewable for an additional 5 years. And so Data One was funded through cyber infrastructure at NSF for a period of 10 years, from 2009 until 2019. And part of that, that funding was to be thinking about sustainability post NSF support. And so we understood and we knew that in 2019, funding from cyber infrastructure in the form of the DataNet initiative would no longer be available. And so Data One has been tackling this question of sustainability for the last 3 years or so. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the approach that we have taken. So as I mentioned, we're a network of data repositories, and really kind of crucial to sustaining Data One is the membership, is that network, is that set of partnerships. We have value in terms of the data that we make available through ease of access and discovery, as well as the services that we layer on top of that. But we wouldn't exist without our network of partners. And so during the period in which we were funded by NSF, we were able to provide the support, technical support for onboarding these repositories as part of the network. As we have transitioned off NSF funding, that hasn't been able to be delivered in the same way. And so enabled to have scalability and have new repositories join, we've been looking at leveraging, for example, schema.org, finding ways for repositories to become part of the network without such a heavy lift, or without a lot of a technical lift, and without that technical support from us. And that has been successful. We've been continuing to onboard repositories since the end of NSF funding. Now, in terms of a funding strategy moving forward, we are looking at a diversification of funding streams. We're looking at grant opportunities, so continued grant opportunities through NSF, not through DataNet initiative, which no longer exists, but utilizing other opportunities and collaborating with partners in this space. But we're also launching a fee-for-service type model. So all of the data that is available within Data One sits in these individual repositories and is publicly accessible. And so we're not ever going to be charging for access to the data. We are a metadata catalog. We're facilitating search, discovery, and access, and that is something that is open and accessible to all. However, a lot of the services that we've been developing provide a value add. And so part of our sustainability strategy moving forward is to be able to have a fee-based model that enables certain users that are interested in these advanced capabilities or value-added features to be able to utilize them with a payment model. So this is something that we had talked about within Data One as we were approaching the end of our NSF funding. The reality of the situation, and COVID, I think, has hit everyone with time delays on everything, is that passing this through as a business model through UCSB, the institution where Data One is based, has taken a long time. And so you haven't yet seen in the community, but we're about to publicly announce the fee for services that we're offering. And these break down into two primary categories. One of them is we will be running hosted repositories. Data One, as I mentioned, is not a repository, but we recognize that some groups want to have a place where they can manage and run a repository for themselves for the data that they are collecting. They might not have the technical capability in-house to do that, and so we can leverage the work that we have done through Data One, through other repositories that we run, to stand up a repository. The other is in terms of being able to subset the data that is within Data One across the whole network to create customized portals. So this might be something that's of value to, for example, a field site or an organization interested in looking at all of the data in one place that comes from their researchers, or an individual research lab that wants to showcase their research productivity and their data assets. And so the portals model is kind of subsetting the data that's already existing within the network, so not setting up a new repository, but just kind of being able to customize the view across that. So these are two primary models that we're launching, and that is our approach to sustaining the network. Is if we can, if there is value in these services across the community, we'll build up revenue through that business model, as well as continuing to apply for grants and supporting Data One through a more traditional academic funded route.
Great, thank you, Amber. That's a nice summary of the work that Data One has been doing with the focus on being able to develop the value-added services. So now I'd invite Kirsten to talk about the work that she's been doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Kai. When I thought about, what to talk about, it actually turns out that, I have over the last decade been working with a number of repository networks in different levels. One is, the geochemistry data facility that I've been heading, EarthChem, built already back in 2005 a network of geochemical databases to provide centralized access to geochemical data. And that was basically a very informal network that has been limping along with the support of the EarthChem facility, but I don't think is an example for something that informs us about solutions for sustainability. I rather talk about the Council of Data Facilities as a network of repositories in this case. And if I have the time, I will briefly mention also the IGSN as an organization that had established a network of institutions that run sample management systems and require unique identifiers for samples. And that has just completed a very rigorous 2.5-year-long process of finding sustainability, which was successfully completed. But yeah, let's get to the Council of Data Facilities, because that is actually an active process going on to identify how this Council of Data Facilities can be a sustainable entity. For those who are not familiar with the CDF, as I will call it briefly, for the rest of what I have to say. The Council of Data Facilities was created through the EarthCube program at a workshop where data facilities came together in a facilitated discussion that ended in creating this CDF as a way for repositories and other data facilities to coordinate and to communicate. It really was much more a social undertaking than a technical one. It has been going as that since 2014 when it was created. It established bylaws and it has an organizational structure. It meets on a monthly basis to exchange and to inform. But as the EarthCube program is ending, the logistical support that the CDF has obtained from EarthCube is also ending, and we have to figure out how we're going to operate in the future. So that triggered a process about a year ago to think about sustainability of just the organization, which in the first place focused on identifying what's the value that the CDF members see in the organization. What are the most valuable services, so to say, of the organization. And that ended, we ran discussions about this at 2 different meetings. And the outcome was that there are 2 aspects. There's a desire to coordinate on standards and drive forward a more interoperable network of these Earth and space science facilities. But the other focus really is on the exchange of knowledge, of expertise, of developments that are going on, potentially organize common training sessions and so on. So far, the CDF has worked without any funding, so except for the support from the EarthCube office. So that is our big concern, and is this value proposition that we are coming up with, is it going to be sufficient for this organization to maintain itself? And how is that going to work? So we currently have a task force going on in the CDF that will figure out how we're actually going to come to a solution in a couple of years, a sustainable, a model for a sustainable CDF. How can we operate that? What type of organization is required? What type of governance? What type of resources are required? And we don't have the solutions now. We're only starting this process, but we are aware that absolutely figuring out the value proposition for the members is the most critical aspect of it. I think I've used up my time probably. So if anything comes up where the IGSN aspects of sustainability are important, then I will bring that up later in discussions.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. So yeah, it's an interesting contrast with the Data One example. It is much more focused on not the physical infrastructure as much as being able to maintain and support the continuing interactions supported by the community that CDF represents.
And that, just to add, as you mentioned, collaboration among networks and so on already points to this, complementarity of different networks with different focus and how much overlap there really also is. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So now we can move on to Daniela, and I will share her slides. Hopefully you can see Daniela's slides.
Thanks, Carl. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool, great. So thanks for having me. For those who don't know me, I work at California Digital Library, but I'm the product manager for Dryad, so I oversee the technology and services for the Dryad repository. Thinking about what sustainability looks like, of course, Dryad is one repository, but we are a repository supporting a network of institutions and publishers who see Dryad as their repository as well. So it's a network in itself that we're supporting more than just our own researchers. And I apologize for loud noise behind me. I hope that dies in a second. Next slide. So if you're not familiar with Dryad, or a refresher, Multi-Disciplinary Repository started over a decade ago in the NSF world by ecology and evolutionary biology researchers. And we're focused on data curation and publishing, making sure best practices, open source, complete metadata, just making sure that we can kind of change the standards around being multidisciplinary and not focused on one specific discipline. Next slide. So thinking about sustainability for us, we were really heavily focused on sustaining awards, especially through the NSF for many years. And we started to pivot and think differently. So in 2018, Dryad partnered with California Digital Library, and this was to think about what's a more sustainable way that Dryad could change its technology platform and then launch an institutional membership that's kind of rooted within the institutional library world. And so that was one way to kind of kick that off. And then we received our next NSF Sustaining Award and thought, how else are we going to get to a point where Dryad is not relying on agency money to do our day-to-day operations, but to get to a point where grants are used for innovation? And so this has really been rooted in collaborative partnerships. And so in 2019, actually, I think we announced at summer meeting ESIP, we partnered with Zenodo. So in thinking, why would we build software support ourselves when we could support Zenodo, who has a similar mission, but is focused on software while we're focused on data? And then similarly in 2020, we partnered with the Open Knowledge Foundation that has frictionless data to think about how we could co-develop an open source tool for data validation at the repositories to relieve some of the time we were putting on our human curators, which is a big cost for sustaining Dryad. Next slide. And so really when it comes down to what sustainability looks like, for us, it's about diverse community support, both by working together through partnerships, but also by direct funding. So in 2019, we launched an institutional model, and I can say now today, our finances are open, so you can see that we were heavily reliant on grants before, but kind of where we see ourselves now and going forward is that institution and publisher memberships make up 70% of covering our operating costs, and 30% is from researchers paying data publishing charges. So we really are at break even right now and are moving towards using grants for innovation going forward. But there's a lot behind this of how much it's taken to get the communities on board. And obviously Dryad's an interesting story because we were one of the first repositories in 2010, I think is when they started charging, having researchers pay data publishing charges like an APC at a journal. And so the world has shifted. And it's kind of interesting to see if this is a model that other repositories could take on as researchers start to see the cost themselves, or as Amber pointed out, if this is something that institutions are looking at more as well. So happy to continue this conversation and lend our experience in that.
Great, thanks, Daniela. And I will stop sharing my screens so I can actually see everybody again. And this is again an interesting contrast to what we've seen so far, as what you're really describing is a sort of bottom-up approach in terms of repositories starting to establish and maintain network connections to provide for repository sustainability, but one outcome of that being the slow growth of a network of repositories that are able to provide complementary capabilities. So thank you. And with that, we will finish our introductory panel presentations with Christine.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's still morning for me, but it always feels funny on the West Coast, and I guess Alaska, so it is morning for many of you. I'm going to put pictures to some of what Kirsten already described, and I went in and quickly added another dimension, some food for thought. And so what I'm going to talk about really sets up some of the things I wanted to bring up in our panel discussion. But as Carl described, I'm at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, where I lead an infrastructure division called Research Data Services that is very focused on making research infrastructure smart and aware of research data management practices, of course, FAIR being a huge one of those. I'm also PI of the EarthCube office, where I've had the honor of serving the EarthCube community and really being an evangelist for all of the things that are happening in earth science at the intersection of geosciences and the builder, the cyber infrastructure community. And if you're you have any questions about EarthCube, you could of course ask me, but I think I noticed that Mike Daniels, our Leadership Council Chair, is also here. And of course, Kirsten has been with EarthCube since the beginning and can describe it well. But it's an $85 million portfolio from NSF that has really given a place for these two communities to intersect, and some great things have come out of it. As Kirsten described, one is the Council of Data Facilities. Of course, all of these groups have been on their own for funding, and the funding that has come has been to try and keep the groups together with, annual meetings, monthly and quarterly touch points, support for the executive board. But there's so much more that is needed for a network of repositories. As you know, I think Kirsten well outlined some of the sustainability issues, of course, being that federal agencies have 10-year horizons on the program. So even the most successful program has to end and find a way to reinvent itself. So with that, with your trust, I'll just divert for a minute into something you haven't heard about, because I think it's another model that we could see working in the geosciences. This is also where a project on which I've spent my time thinking as a repository owner and not just a repository network. So this is in metabolomics. You hear people talk about multi-omics, right? Genomics, proteomics, lipidomics, you have the microbiome. We have metabolomics, which is it's hard to spell, hard to say. But basically, it's not just about the body, even though that's where it comes up a lot. You do see it mostly funded by NIH. And I work there on things like outreach on the standard of identifying and tagging metabolites, because we've only identified about 10% of the known ones. And sometimes we get to implement really fun things. For example, there's the story up, if you want to go read about it, where there are no normal ranges established. If you got your blood tested and you wanted to measure a metabolite, people don't really know what is the normal amount, but the person who leads the research on the metabolomics workbench went and looked across and said, well, I can't tell you what's normal, but I can tell you what's typical. And there are, of course, metabolites thrown off in all sorts of earth processes, agricultural processes. Now, there's a whole collection of these kind of repositories that were part of the NIH Data Commons. Well, one way that NIH has helped those groups is they've established a new thing called the Common Fund Data Ecosystem, and I've got links here that you can go check these things out. The Common Fund Data Ecosystem was sort of like a new portfolio program, like an EarthCube, if you will, but its main thing is working on what new value comes when you join all these things together and make them interoperable. As a result, it's funded some phenomenal work, from ontology crosswalks to training on FAIR, training on data stewardship. And I would hope that there would be something like this that NSF would look to offering towards our community in the earth sciences to help with some of these sustainability challenges, so that we can go further than just having money to host meetings, but really to support the work. Here's some work that I think we have spent a lot of time talking about and trying to support in the EarthCube community. I call them different approaches to building the data space, and they're not mutually exclusive. Of course, we know about linked data, and I know you would all glaze over if I started talking about it, so we won't, it's hard. But I think we are all pretty taken with schema.org, especially the work that's been done here at ESIP on science on schema. And so a lot of that repository network work has been on how can we implement that for metadata, and how can we support the network? So what are things that everyone's needing, and so that they are prepared to be in Data One or in whatever UI they're trying to show up in. Another one that the repositories have been looking at, not so much CDF yet, is the implementation of fair digital objects. So don't touch your data, don't try and add anything to it. Instead, have a new wrapper master object that can find all the pieces and put it together. And we will soon have posted the recordings from yesterday's high-level panel on this. So with that, I hope I didn't use too much time. This is how to get a hold of me or heckle me for being in San Diego wearing a sweater and a sweatshirt on a Zoom. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for being able to highlight some additional models that are emerging from outside of the earth science community that we can hopefully also learn some lessons from, and then also highlighting the ongoing challenges that the EarthCube network, as many of us continue to face. So this is the point at which we were looking to start the conversation within the entire group that is here in the session. And if you look in the shared notes, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a set of questions that we developed that we thought might be interesting in the context of our topic. But again, if there are other questions, it would probably be worthwhile to go ahead and add them to the chat, as we'll be monitoring that and trying to integrate those into the discussion as well. So with that, one of the initial questions that came to mind for us as we were trying to differentiate between the question of repository sustainability and the sustainability of networks. And I think in the introductory remarks, we've seen some hints of those different perspectives from the network perspective and from the individual repository perspective, and how they, in some cases, may converge towards the development of new networks or drive towards participation in existing networks, but also how networks can add value for their participants. And that may be another way to be able to move towards sustainability. So the first question we'd like to ask is, from in the context of our group here, what does sustainability mean to you in terms of, and different models of sustainability for the networks versus the sustainability requirements for individual repositories, and where might we see some overlap where there are some shared interests and motivations that we can identify?
I'd be happy to jump in, Carl, because I had
That would be great. Thank you.
A place to start. Of course, sustainability in the mind of a manager or anyone who has those kind of responsibilities, it's how do I keep my good people going, right? But when I reflected on your question, for me, it really came down to persistent metadata that's searchable from a network. Even though the people are important and matter most to us as other people, the sustainability is really in, finding out about that data.
So in that respect, it's maybe sustainability of capacity or capability to continue access to the data, or discovery and access to the data.
Right, but it's very core, even after hundreds of years. It's that metadata.
Yeah. Kirsten.
Yeah. So my reaction, obviously, as I mentioned, CDF is more of a social network than it is a technical network, at least at the moment. And when I think of the sustainability, what does it mean for the network is actually ongoing engagement. a structure that and a, yeah, as I said, value proposition and a service that makes people want to participate on an ongoing basis and contribute. And, you know, I mean, in some way, to me, ESIP is a great example of a network in that respect. You know, CDF has some different aspects, but there is a lot of overlap actually with what ESIP is doing. And, you know, we should be looking at what has worked well for ESIP, what has not worked in other occasions. To me, that it reminds me a few years ago, I think it was the ESIP meeting in Tacoma, and we actually ran a session on epic failures. I don't know if some of you may remember that. And you know what you said before is, you know, we need to look for models, be they more technical or be they more social, that have worked, and we need to include those that have not worked and really understand how you know people stay compliant with metadata, how they stay engaged in discussions and coordination efforts and so on. And I think that's a real project for us to engage in doing such an analysis of the landscape.
Great, thank you. Amber.
Yeah, so following on from what Kirsten was saying about engagement, I think engagement is critical for networks, whether social or technical. As I mentioned in the case of Data One, we can have a funding model that has a fee-based service, but without the partnership, without the repositories being the network, then there's nothing to leverage and build on top of. And so that engagement is critical. And I think when thinking about engagement, you need to think about motivation. And I think the motivations for engagement are going to be different for networks than they are for the individual repositories. If we think about requirements, individuals participate in placing their data into a repository for the value of sharing data, but there's also a policy component to that. And so understanding the motivations that the individual researchers engage with repositories or might engage with the network is really important to thinking about the sustainability model.
Great, thank you.
I guess I can add from the Dryad perspective, maybe it's all about trust is what sustainability would mean, that there's trust in the institutions, publishers, funders, and researchers that are sustaining to both use it and trusting that the co-development projects and everything that's happening is just trusted, moving, working as it should. And it's a little bit different than the financials, but not having questions around, will the operations, will the repository, will the data be there, will it continue to build and not just be maintained. I think sustainability for us is always going to be that it's building more and not just maintaining what we currently have, because we probably wouldn't survive if we were just maintaining.
Great, thank you. And it's interesting, thinking about these different aspects of sustainability when it comes to networks or individual repositories, and that trust component is, I think, particularly important, and I think underlies what we're talking about in terms of the trust within the participants of the network, that participation is going to yield continuing results and meet what are sort of the evolving needs of the network. And Daniela, your comment about growth or change sort of made me think about that as having a core set of capabilities, as Christine mentioned, in terms of having that minimum standard of maintaining and preserving the metadata and the discoverability and access to the data is a critical core function, and probably the one that requires the highest level of trust. But I think there's a reasonable expectation from the community of participants that our networks and the participating repositories would also continue to evolve to move towards emerging capabilities and expectations from users. Great. Any other comments from the rest of our group here?
I'd just like to add something that we didn't surface, and that's, oh, and sorry, I didn't mean to scoop Jeff DLB, but it's the need to also include, it doesn't have to be an age thing, but people earlier in their career. You get these wonderful networks built up, and they have 20 and 30 years of trust amongst them. And then it's fair, they get to retire, or they get to be emeritus, and who's going to take up that mantle? You need to be thinking in 10-year horizons at least, and building up these capabilities and sharing the relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know ESIP, as we were celebrating our 20th birthday last year, has been around long enough that we've now been experiencing for some time that cycle of early participants moving on into retirement and looking at different models to stay engaged with the community, but also the community needing to look at ways to capture and convey that expertise from those folks that may be moving on to other chapters in their lives. Jeff.
Yeah, thanks everybody for interesting summary so far and discussion. As you were talking, I was thinking of the question, is it more important to sustain the networks or the underlying repositories themselves? So I was glad to see that was sort of your first question on the thing. I promise I didn't scroll down and cheat. And I agree it's important to preserve the metadata, to sustain the people, to improve things. But I also feel like, the most fundamental is the original metadata and the data. I'm concerned that we're taking on commitments, and I include NCAR in this, to host extremely large data sets for, decade or two or more, and we have to be able to sustain that. And I mean, at NCAR, we're fortunate that it's, within a much larger federally funded research and development center that, has an expensive supercomputer, and so things like the data are just a portion of that. But I'm worried that we will lose irreplaceable observations if we don't have an ongoing method to, at minimum, preserve with a basic level of service. And I'm concerned that organizations like NSF are not well suited, or prefer not to fund those kinds of ongoing things. So this is something that keeps me, well, I won't say awake at night, but at least during the day, I worry about it.
Thank you, Jeff. Kirsten.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Jeff's comment. I agree that obviously, the foundation of a data infrastructure are the individual repositories that need to be sustained. But I do think that networks such as the CDF or Data One can contribute to the sustainability of the individual repositories. And this is, something that has been brought up in the CDF as a value proposition, is to actually speak with a common voice and be heard more. If we have networks of repositories that lobby together, that have a strong voice, that would already help with the overall sustainability of the research data infrastructure. While I also think that these networks can help kind of sustain across the whole board of repositories, and saying if funding goes away at 1-for-1, maybe the network can catch the data and make sure that they will still be maintained and so on. So I do see a substantial value and necessity to keep the networks going as well as the individual repositories.
Jeff.
Can I Yeah, just to follow on. So I agree. I mean, the network does have a benefit, and it can include helping to sustain the members and lobbying. It occurs to me, though, it may seem self-serving if the networks of repositories are lobbying for more funding for themselves. We also need to train the users, in particular the data providers, to lobby to say, hey, I gave you my data, you know, how come you're not preserving it? Or, you know, how come you agency are not continuing to fund this after you told me to put my data there? And now 3 years from now, you're cutting the funding. I need the data to still be there. So make sure the data owners are really invested in having their data, as opposed to just checking the box. Oh yeah, the journal told me I had to put my data somewhere, so I put it somewhere, but now I don't care because I'm doing some other work. So
I think we've just heard a couple of examples of roles that networks can play in terms of being able to make the case for the repository, the sustainability of the repositories that are participating in the network, and also potentially being able to provide a safety net. Jeff, to your point about being able to mobilize the value statements or the value that the users of the repositories and the network, is that something, do you think, that is effectively or more efficiently provided or performed at the level of the network or at the individual repositories? Or is this another area of interoperability that we need to think about in terms of capturing and communicating and organizing those sort of use stories and values?
I don't know. I don't know where it would be better done, but I certainly know that if we said, okay, we've cut funding for this repository and all the data within it will be deleted, presumably some people are going to not be happy and could be mobilized to complain about that. So ideally we'd want to do that before it was too late, obviously, but I don't know the answer.
Okay. So any other comments on, Kirsten? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a comment that was in the chat pertaining to this issue about data coming from other countries that do not have the resources and so on. It just raised to me the thoughts about international networks and the collaboration across borders, and that I find specifically difficult to sustain in a good manner, because, you know, political agendas keep changing, and funding in different countries keeps changing. And so to maintain on an ongoing basis connections between networks and between repositories and collaboration between repositories is a particularly challenging aspect that, you know, is in some ways another necessary step, but different from us, you know, having repositories within the same political environment and the same funding structures that we are all taking advantage of. And, you know, thinking about data resources in countries that don't have the means to maintain them in the long term is another aspect of why networks are so important to potentially help with that, you know, building structures that allow that to be supported.
Thank you. Christine.
Sure. I hope it's okay to take this, because I think it gives us another example of sustainability. And thank you to Nadia for bringing that up, and Kirsten for her comments. So one example of a data network is the Virus Outbreak Data Network Africa, and I'll put in the chat the link if you'd like to look at it later. But this brings up a couple key points. One, yes, we do want to definitely help countries that are under-resourced in this area, but we need to do it carefully. There was a history in Africa, especially during the Ebola crisis, of Western countries, researchers coming in, bringing data infrastructure. And then once the crisis was over, they took it all back. And so the host countries were no better off than before, the crisis. And so at the outset of COVID, this actually in one of the workshops I was hosting, some of the participants in the back were, this was February 2020, were responding, and they worked with partners across Africa and the EU to establish this network. And it's called the Virus Outbreak Data Network because they say after COVID, we had Ebola, we have had other things, we'll have something next. But what they did is they leveraged some of the Western partners, especially in the Netherlands, to advocate for funding along Jeff's comments there for the individual partners who didn't necessarily have the capabilities yet or the understanding of how to lobby private funders and foundations or agency funding. They banded together, and some of it includes training on capacity so that they can put up their own very minimal infrastructure, and so that the data catalog, if you will, can be governed amongst the group so that the data can stay in country and not have the issues of data sovereignty violated. But anyway, I could say a lot more about it, but there's an example, and I think to Nadia's point, and I really like this one because in the US, I feel like sometimes the answer is, oh, if it's great, industry is going to pick it up. Well, we can see how great industry has performed in some of the other aspects of our digital life with, Facebook and things like that. And so I don't know that I don't think we're going to count on industry to always solve things, and especially where there are gaps with what the agencies will fund. But I could highlight that as we get down to that question.
Great, thank you. And I think this is probably a good point to potentially transition to one of our other questions that I think we've seen aspects of this raised already in some of the discussion in terms of, what we might have already seen in terms of successful or unsuccessful models for sustaining repository networks. And I've been hearing either some specific references or identified needs already discussed, but this topic that we've just had in terms of the internationalization of repository or repository networks seems to be another dimension that I hadn't heard yet in terms of potentially a sustainability solution, but it comes to mind that being able to distribute the resource demands and use internationally through larger partnerships could potentially help offset, some of those political or budgetary dynamics that exist within individual countries, and expand the safety net a little bit more broadly. So, what do our panelists and the others in the session? What have they seen in terms of successful or unsuccessful examples or strategies for sustaining repository networks?
God, it's me again.
That's quite all right, Kirsten.
So I think what we just completed, I mentioned earlier that the IGSN is this organization of institutions that manage samples digitally and need unique identifiers. Just completed this project to build a more sustainable organization. That project was funded by the Sloan Foundation. And I think we very successfully ended this by creating a partnership between IGSN and DataCite, where DataCite is a sustainable organization, as sustainable as can be, I guess. All the technical work that is required to run the infrastructure for this network will be operated by DataCite within their business model. And the organization, the IGSN EV itself, will focus more on the community work with a community manager who will also basically support it by through the business model at DataCite, with the expectation that over the next 2-3 years, we will grow the IGSN usage through DataCite enough to support that structure. So it is, in some way taking advantage of existing infrastructure and capabilities that do operate. That is probably not applicable to every one of the networks that we're talking about, but it was a very, I think, careful strategic planning effort, facilitated with a lot of expertise, external expertise beyond the group, that helped us actually, take a look from outside and say, what do we want to do? What do we need to do? What are people willing to contribute to keep the services going? So it's not easy, but I think there are processes that you can take to strategically plan your sustainability.
So Kirsten, in the example of your partnership with DataCite and the IGSN sort of being able to be hosted within their infrastructure, I'm curious because I think this varies from network to network in terms of the sort of the computational or storage requirements for your particular set of materials for IGSN in comparison to some other networks. As you know, we've been talking about Data One, and I see Matt just hopped in, as that may be a dynamic in being able to exercise that strategy. I may pass it to Matt.
I mean, the requirements are not that big, it's the registration service. So it's software maintenance, it's system administration. There's no computational storage requirements in that. That are the members of the network that take care of that, right?
Great, thank you. Matt.
So I just wanted to kind of shift to a different topic, Carl, if that's okay.
Okay.
Just a little bit. I wanted to come back to something that Jeff said earlier about sustaining data, and I think it's a really important point. I think one of the challenges we face is that a lot of repository networks are relatively generic, and repositories themselves are oftentimes generic. The ones that I think researchers see as the most valuable are the ones that are really vertically integrated databases that provide a lot of services to a really specific type of data. So you take like something like the Protein Data Bank or GenBank, where every researcher under the sun that works in those areas knows about those resources and utilizes them, on a regular basis. But when you broaden that to all the types of data that researchers collect, it's really hard to imagine how we would sustain enough individually integrated databases like that to actually keep things going. And so there's this tension, I think, between sustaining data in a way that's the most useful to researchers, which is necessarily, I think, incredibly focused on small data types, but also sustaining the entire repository landscape, which supports all the long tail data and diverse data types that really aren't picked up by that. And so I'm just curious, like, what is the different role of, say, funding agencies in maintaining community databases like those specialized ones versus general purpose repositories and repository networks, which I think is part of our tension here.
Yeah, I think that is the case in terms of and where do the networks play a role in this in terms of potentially providing an interoperability or higher level of discovery across what might be a more specialized set of disciplinary and disciplinarily focused repositories versus general purpose repositories. Is that also what you're getting towards, Matt?
Yeah.
Matt, can you provide more detail though? Because I guess I understand that in theory, but Dryad and Zenodo combined get tens of thousands, 20, 40,000 data set submissions a year. So why would that put us at a disadvantage if we do have other outlets of where those data sets are coming from? I guess I'm am missing why multidisciplinary makes it harder to sustain.
I'm not saying it makes it harder to sustain. I think that I was talking more about this issue of the way researchers view things and whether we can get them behind us on things. Like, I think researchers they very easily see the value proposition in keeping all of the data in their specific discipline in a really organized and structured way that they can deeply query all of the data, say, on protein structures. Whereas going to like a database, like we run the K&B Data Archive or the Arctic Data Center, which has a bunch of genetics data, a bunch of protein data, but it's not, they're individual data sources that have their own idiosyncratic approach to organizing that stuff. And it's mixed in with a bunch of atmospheric data and oceanography and other stuff. And so although you might be able to discover that data set is there, for a protein, biologist that's interested in a specific thing, it doesn't have nearly the value that having that data in the PDB has. And so I think we need the general purpose repositories to capture the breadth of scientific research people are doing, but at the same time, like, I find that scientists don't advocate for that general purpose approach as much as they do for the community specialized database approach. And I've been trying to figure out how you span those worlds. I mean, mandates are the one thing that has changed that a bit. Like, I think funder mandates for deposition and publisher mandates for deposition have changed the sort of sustainability model for general purpose repositories, but that wasn't a grassroots thing that came from individual researchers to say, I need access to protein data.
Yes.
Good point, Matt, that, researchers, data depositors often want more specialized services that are relevant to their data, as opposed to just a place to park their data. Maybe one approach to sustainment and funding, I think we were talking a little bit about the fees for service, fees for storage, fees for other services, could be to separate those two. Like, if you just want storage and very basic, discovery and access capability that's cheaper than if you or your community wants something built on top of that, which actually links together data submitted by other people in the same discipline. I mean, that's a lot more work, right? The sort of custom data portal as opposed to just a repo. So maybe we have to essentially charge more, or the agencies have to pay more if that's what's wanted.
And I might surface Leslie's comment in the chat in terms of the key advantage of general purpose repositories is getting the data off the C drives and thumb drives, where, I think that's an important community value proposition in terms of being able to make a step towards long-term preservation, discovery, and access. But that still doesn't necessarily address the more specialized data use or discovery requirements that disciplinary researchers might have. And this is where we might also be seeing the tension between incentives to deposit data into a repository versus incentives to use a repository to find data for reuse. As the data users, in my experience, typically have they enjoy using repositories that are able to provide more specificity in the searches and discovery and access, and perhaps even the services that may be built on top of the data within those what would typically be disciplinary repositories, where the depositors, if they are not strongly engaged with sort of the community value of and exchange of those data, may be looking for an opportunity to get their data into a repository that would meet those publisher or sponsor requirements, but not necessarily require them to go to the extra effort that it might take to provide more rich or structured disciplinary metadata that support those value-added services. So I think there's a tension in different users or use cases that may be in play here. Amber.
Yeah, I agree. And that's kind of also following up from Jeff's earlier comment about the idea of mobilizing these data depositors to advocate for sustainability of the repositories and the repository networks. And I think back in the chat, someone said, sometimes they deposit and go, as it were. And I think that the community that are going to be the advocates for the repository networks are those that are engaged in using the data. And so at NCEAS, we work with a lot of people that are conducting synthesis. It's in our name, synthesis research. And so these are data users that really do leverage networks and leverage these repositories to be able to build research on existing data. And so I think that more advanced user, not necessarily technically advanced, but individuals that are not necessarily working with their own data, but they're integrating data across all of these different sources, that user community are going to be the community that are going to be our best advocates for sustainability because they're actively using these services, and whether it be a fee-based service that's layered on, or whether it's something that's currently open to the broader community. And I think that recognition, as you were saying, Carl, of the importance of high quality metadata and data preservation is really embraced by researchers when they're on the other end, when they're trying to work with other people's data. And so I think there's a role for data science literacy and advocacy, so that when people go through the process of submitting the data, their data submission is embedded within best practices. There's an education component that can happen there, but also in other trainings and opportunities that I know a lot of these repositories are running and institutions are running to increase the level of awareness of the importance of well-preserved data. I think that's still necessary. I think it's still absent in a large population of the community.
Great, thank you. So Daniela, I might ask in particular, as you're coming in from the perspective of one of our large and rapidly growing general purpose repositories now in collaboration with Zenodo, another large repository that has been developing some specialization in and a growing focus as a destination as a repository for code. How do you see this dynamic between the value proposition of the general purpose repositories and the disciplinary repositories? As I definitely see space for both, but I think they may be addressing these different use cases in a somewhat specialized way.
Yeah, I think it's that we all generally need to shift our focus to the use of the data. I think for so long it was driving Stride and Zenodo make it so easy, throw all your data there. And then at some point, who cares? And so now it's really trying to understand how can large multidisciplinary repositories actually make it easy to reuse what the data is, regardless of the data type. And I think Dryad's in a little bit of a different position because we kind of are a disciplinary repository in the ecology world. It still is over half of the submissions, and ecologists still see it that way. Of course, EDI and others, we're not the only. But I think beyond that, it's going to be more interesting to see how we can evolve to build things, especially together among some of the generalists, for how we can get researchers to care to reuse it. And I was having this conversation with someone at our Open Sci lately who was saying, yeah, sure, Dryad is great, but I'm just tossing it over the wall and it's curated and I know that it's fine and it'll be there and it's preserved, but I want to go try and use things that are there. And so that's, I think, the big shift right now that we have to be thinking about. And I don't know how, I think that differs for disciplinary repositories, as Matt said, because scientists have specific ways that they're using that data and that they're used to it. But I do think that there's general ways that people are thinking about trying to use data, especially in things that are happening like a pandemic. It's not just that you're using one discipline and you're using all these different sources. So I just think now is the time that exactly what you asked is what we have to figure out, and it's less about making it super easy to deposit.
Great, thank you. Kirsten. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I just realized that I wanted to be diligent and mute myself while I'm not talking, and then it's, no, I think this is a really important point to bring up, and this sort of leveraging capabilities of the general or generalistic repositories and those that are domain specific. And I see, you know, there were comments in the chat also about, you know, small disciplines and you know, how it's a challenge in, you know, having so many different data types and domains all need to maintain their own repositories versus having these larger infrastructures of general repositories. And I see on my side, you know, with running a repository in a fairly small domain in geochemistry, maintaining that infrastructure. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to explore with respect to domain-specific curation versus the actually maintenance of a repository infrastructure. If that is something that, you know, where dialogue is established, I think it has a lot of potential. Really, what I think, you know, we at EarthCamp, the big value that we add to the data is a curation process, is our data curators looking at the file saying, well, you know, this metadata is missing and you know, you've used some acronym nobody will be able to understand in the future and so on. And, you know, I would love to then just push a button and send the good and, you know, domain standardized data set onto a different repository where it can be discovered broadly. So, you know, I think there's a great potential and a dialogue that we should be starting, and, you know, building networks that include both types of repositories.
Great, thank you. Yes, and you know, that last point about the sort of streamlined replication, you know, that comes back to that sort of safety net role that repository networks can play. And I look back to, you know, my very early engagement with Data One, and that capability of the network through the replication node model within the network was one of the things that that for me was a strong differentiator and a strong value as I was looking at what Data One could bring to the repository space. But yeah, the complexity there is, again, the building and maintaining and sustaining the capacity to be able to maintain that safety net. And where does the support for that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to chime in and mention that we've had that happen within the Data One network. We have replication capabilities within the network, and we've had repositories, individual repositories that are no longer operational as a repository, but the data are still available through the Data One network. You know, so, you know, this is a living example of sustainability challenges that repositories are facing.
Right, and I think about the flip side in terms of the reality that struck home, and I'm now trying to remember exactly when, but it was when the digital preservation network shut down after its first year of operation, because the business model that they had developed for being able to do data replication and supporting the preservation needs of their member organizations did not match the assumptions of their business model. And that only became clear once they became operational, and the tension between what was being asked of the members in terms of documentation and process to deposit into the network became real in comparison to the value proposition that the network was providing. And when folks actually needed to start doing something with their data in the network, that was actually when that the assumptions in their business model ultimately contributed to the failure of that network. So we've got about 13 minutes left. So this would be a good point to maybe open the floor for maybe a final topic or two that folks would like to maybe focus on, but also remind all of us, because this would be a good point at the bottom of the session notes. There is the section on the takeaways and shared insights. And this is when I would invite any and all of you to think about what you've heard in our discussion today and add to those notes what you think, what insights you've gained, what ideas you've developed along the lines of the discussion that we've been having, contributing to ultimately our shared outcome from this session. And again, the link to those notes is right here. Christine.
Sure. So I wanted to make sure before we close that I get to raise a topic. And I know we speak a lot about what's incumbent upon data repositories, what should be offered by the networks. But I do think it should be recognized that some things are just too much to ask of data repositories and networks, and that some of the things that we need to alleviate these issues with sustainability, with making things cost less to host and easier for researchers, need to come from innovations external to data repositories and networks. And for those of you, probably many of us on the call who use the early internet, if you think of early internet was a set of data repositories of text, right? And we would put up our websites and we would email each other, hey, here. So actually, one of the first websites I used was on Ebola, right? When there were like 20 websites to use. And I would have to register new websites with things like Alta Vista. I remember running a video streaming service and talking with other people who had video streaming servers about, ways to make the storage work and what do you do with the cost? Well, all of these have been fixed by other innovations, right? And we just take it for granted. And some of these things are easy. People who put up web pages that were just images, they didn't get indexed, so they learned to use standards. And so, of course, we can't, I did say earlier that we can't rely on industry to do everything, but we need some innovations outside. And so this is where data repository networks can be lobbying, in the spaces where they see gaps and things that are just harder than they should be. And this is where our governments need to come in and say, data is a national resource. We can't just have it fall to NSF, but that's really not their role to sustain these things. We can't look to them and be mad at them when they don't give us money to keep things going. I mean, we are sometimes, but we need a better national data strategy in the US, and I suspect many other countries as well.
Great, thank you. And Jeff.
Yeah, Christine, thanks for mentioning that, because I was going to mention something similar, maybe, which is wondering whether artificial intelligence will help with some of these things. We've, ESIP and other groups have sort of AI, ML, data readiness clusters. It seems that when data are well standardized and well documented, that in theory, software will increasingly be able to provide some of the value-added services, such as curating the nice collection or gathering for you the nice collection of related data that's relevant to your topic and fit for purpose, regardless of where it's stored, just by having been able to crawl it and read it and give you access to it. So maybe some of the things we're doing by hand now, we won't have to do anymore. Or maybe that's just a stupid pipe dream. I don't know, we'll see. But 10 years from now, things are going to be pretty different.
Absolutely. And that was something that I was starting to think about a few minutes ago, because to your point, having well-documented, well-structured data, even as the training data for those models, could potentially enable the reprocessing of data sets that are
reasonably structured, but may not have as robust or complete metadata in their current state, but may be able to be crawled and evaluated and enhanced through the application of AI models based on well-documented, well-structured data as training materials. It'll level up those sparsely documented data sets that are out there in abundance. There was a question in the chat around institutional repositories, typically managed by libraries, and how do they fit in the landscape? And Matt?
Go ahead. Let's address that one, and I'll come back later.
Okay. And that's an interesting question, as for the last now coming on 8 years, I've crossed over into the library space here at UNM, and been somewhat up close and personal in terms of looking at the strengths and weaknesses of our institutional repository, particularly for data. And we've been fortunate to be able to move into the institutional model that Dryad provides as a complement to our institutional repository, primarily because the metadata model that is commonly associated with traditional library institutional repositories is not particularly well suited for data. It's more useful for bibliographic and citation document-based content. And as a result, there certainly could be integrated into repository networks, but the metadata model may not enable strong use, especially for data that may be a minority player in some of those repositories. Matt?
Yeah, well, sorry. So I had a different topic, but I'm going to just keep going on this because I think this is an important issue. This issue of if we were to get institutional repositories to be sort of a backbone of the archival landscape, like I think one of the challenges is getting them to embrace domain-specific and disciplinary-specific standards, whether that's metadata standards, but also data standards. I think you're right that the libraries tend to come from a document-centric history, where they're mostly focused on archiving textual materials and some audiovisual and multimedia. But it's really about bibliographic documentation of who produced something and who should be cited for it, and less of the structural metadata and information for being able to understand and reuse complex data structures that come from complex technical landscapes. So if we were to get institutional repositories involved, it seems like a good layer for the common core archival functions, but there needs to be a layer on top of that that helps interface those with domains. I don't think we can depend upon libraries to gain that kind of disciplinary specific knowledge across all the disciplines to really be that central place. So maybe there's a role for us to build shared networks where that kind of like indirect funding supported archival function that libraries have played can have a relationship to domain specific databases that are built on top of it and stuff. It would be an interesting way to look at the longer term funding.
Great. Well, we've got just 5 minutes left. Matt, did you have something else, or are there any other topics or questions that folks might want to bring up before we close out?
So on a different topic, I did want to ask see what people thought about this. Like, I think one of the challenges of sustaining networks in particular is this issue of overlapping communities of practice, where there are a lot of bodies trying to create networks. They overlap a lot, but they're not completely congruent. And so you look at something like the GIOS system that comes out of the international community. You look at like a network like Data One, or you look at the European Union efforts on the Horizon 2020 programs and all of their data networks they're building. Things like EarthCube and the CDF, and you can keep going on. There's lots and lots of overlapping networks that are trying to do in many ways the same thing. And I've frequently had in the back of my head, how can we try to basically, I mean, without creating like this gigantic global monstrosity that's like hard to manage, how can we build effective collaborations among these groups that are trying to basically accomplish the same thing, but are just rooted in a slightly different community of practice, you know, slightly overlapping, but not completely congruent one. I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important part of what we need to address. It's like the geo versus, if you take it in the NSF world, it's the geo versus bio directorate, you know, emphases, like how do you get the people that are focused on biodiversity data and the people focused on our science data to be working together, given that they're just so similar in needs, but also come from really different disciplinary roots.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, that is a continuing challenge. And I think even the challenge is growing with increased focus and need for not just inner, but transdisciplinary research and transition of knowledge. So Christine.
Yeah, I think one of the answers is lies within data itself and data that we need to collect about what we're doing. It's to educate funders about how much they're paying to reinvent wheels. They might look different and they might be very excited about these different things they funded, but oftentimes what's been done in one directorate is that they think is brand new was done 5 years ago in another and just labeled differently. As well, I think we need to document how much time it takes researchers, people with advanced degrees, to do, once you've had some training, what essentially feels like clerical tasks. What if those people's brains could be used on actual research topics? You know, how much further would we be along on some of our societal challenges? We need to make these compelling arguments and say, look, you're wasting human capital and resources and time that could be spent in better ways. Yeah, another pipe dream, but keep playing the tune.
Excellent. Well, you know, this is the stage in the game where it's often useful to share those pipe dreams and feed our optimism for the future. Do we have any other closing comments or remarks in our last couple of minutes, folks? What folks have seen or what you've learned in our discussion today? As I'm not hearing anything, what I would suggest is that we've certainly, I think, highlighted both some challenges and what I would probably describe as some emerging strategies for how we can sustain both the repositories and the networks that those repositories exist within, and also been able to see some of the value that those different types of networks bring. As Kirsten highlighted, essentially a repository network model in which it is focused on being able to bring repositories together to share knowledge and standards and develop strategies for being able to effectively collaborate and interoperate with each other, whether it's existing networks such as Data One, where it's a matter of how do you continue to demonstrate the value of that network and sustain it more diversely, with greater diversity than the traditional grant funding cycle and sustaining grants approach. And as Christine has highlighted, especially the lessons we can learn from other networks and bring into our community, and try to not reinvent the wheel, but look at what the emerging models are and how we can either adopt or participate in them. The perspective that Daniela has been able to bring in terms of the working from the repository perspective and moving from the questions of being able to sustain and efficiently operate your repository and how participating in a network of repositories can help support that. I think those are all useful perspectives that have come out in our discussion today. I want to thank Amber, Daniela, Christine, and Kirsten for kicking us off with some great motivating presentations and participating with our other folks in the session, and look forward to seeing you out there in other sessions. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.